Attention, attention please. Quiet please. Our meeting is ready to continue. Ladies and gentlemen, our speaker is here in the hall, so let's get back to the meeting. As I said in the beginning, this is a landmark meeting for the Kips Bay Group. We celebrate our first anniversary. As it's a special event, we have asked a special friend to speak to us tonight. To many of us, he's an old friend. And for some of you, we hope he'll become a new one. Usually, the Kips Bay Group is a closed meeting for alcoholics only. Due to tonight's special circumstances, we have opened the meeting to our families and friends. Our only request is that our guests respect the wishes of the group. Those wishes are as follows. What you hear here tonight, take it home with you. What you see here, who you see here, and who you meet here, leave that knowledge behind. Anonymity is the spiritual backbone of our program. Again, please, help us maintain this spiritual legacy. Before introducing our speaker, I'll read a statement of purpose, as written in the foreword of the Big Book, Alcoholics Anonymous. We are not an organization in the conventional sense of the word. There are no fees or dues whatsoever. The only requirement for membership is an honest desire to stop drinking. We are not allied with any particular faith, sect, or denomination, nor do we oppose anyone. We simply wish to be helpful to those who are afflicted. Now, with that out of the way, let me introduce our speaker. He has been called the greatest social architect of our century. The 12-step program he's developed is America's greatest invention. His extraordinary energy and action were a major contribution to the success of our fellowship. Without that contribution, we would more than likely not be here tonight. Lord knows where I would be. It can be said of Bill that there were moments in his life, and he gave his life to those moments. Please join me in welcoming Bill W., co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, to share some of the moments with us tonight.
Thank you, Carol, for that warm introduction. Lois and I need to catch a train immediately after this, so our entrance will probably be as early as our exit was late. But I do apologize. Please do have us back again in the future. We tried to get a flight, but during this Korean War mess, flights were hard to come by. So, we have to leave right after. I do apologize. But do please have us back again in the future. As some of you may have heard, our good friend Dr. Bob has passed. So to commemorate this momentous occasion, I jotted down a few notes. So, with your permission. We meet tonight to celebrate this group's anniversary and the late Dr. Bob Smith. We thank God that He has freed many of us out of bondage. We are here tonight to tell all our friends of our deepest gratitude and all they have done to help us in this wholesale miracle of recovery, and to share with them and with each other the sure evidence of God's grace among us. So much for speech making. It is customary in AA not to make speeches. We usually just talk about ourselves and of our experience and those around us. My talk tonight will be no different. They call it the bedtime story. So if it puts you to sleep, remember, you've been warned. In September of '34, just 16 years ago, I was a patient at the Charles B. Towns Hospital up on Central Park West. Lois and I were at the end of a long, hard road. I had been to Charlie's place before. I knew the staff, the routine, good old Silky, Dr. Silkwood. He knew me. As a matter of fact, in an earlier time, he felt I was an exception to most of what he'd seen before. He thought I could recover, but I proved him wrong. On my second visit to Dry Out, he made some reservations. With this, my third trip this year, he gave up. As I lay there, upstairs, in bed, this dear, kind man was discussing my future with my wife. His prognosis, death, madness, or immediate voluntary confinement to be kept away from alcohol for the rest of my life, no matter how short that life might be. Poor Lois. As gentle as that doctor could be, it wasn't gentle enough. When he told her the hopelessness of my case, she was nearly out of her mind. But doctor, she said, Bill has such willpower. You never met such an obstinate man. When he puts his mind to something, he never lets go. He has tried everything. We have tried everything. Why, doctor? Why can't he stop? And this dear kind man explained to her his theory, developed over the years after treating thousands of alcoholics, that my drinking And once a habit had now become an obsession, a true insanity that condemned me to drink against my will, no matter how strong that will might be. And explaining further, he told that my body had become allergic to the very substance it craves, and that it will soon kill me or drive me mad. He was telling me that I was an alcoholic, and that my condition was hopeless. Well, he told me the same thing just a few hours before. As I lay there, in those canvas pajamas, I knew the score. I was 39 years old, and I was finished. Finished. But how had it happened? Maybe if I go back to the beginning, I could explain the end. You see, I was born in Vermont 5 years before the turn of the century in 1895. My birthplace could have served as an omen for my future. I was born behind the bar of my grandmother's hotel. An early childhood memory was on my 4th birthday. I remember gazing out the window toward a mountain wondering, would I ever be able to climb that high? And at the same moment, my aunt distracted me with a plate of fudge. And with just one bite, I forgot all about that mountain and began my 35-year pursuit for the fudge of life. Well, at the age of 10, due to my parents' divorce, I was sent to live with my grandparents. A wonderful couple, good old-fashioned Yanks, a rare breed, rarely found today. I was a tall, gawky kid, easily pushed around. The breakup of my family, divorce was extremely rare in those days, added to my lack of self-confidence, putting me in a depression that would last for over a year, one of many throughout my life. But with the help of my grandfather, and giving me a book on Australia, he mentioned that the Bushmen were the only ones capable of making and throwing a boomerang. Well, if that was the case, I decided right then and there that I'd become the first American to do likewise. Now, most kids would live with an idea like this for a few days, a week at the most. But for me, it became a 6-month power drive. I whittled on every piece of what I could find, including the headboard of my bed. But by God, I did. I made a boomerang, threw it, and it came back. Never mind, nearly took off the back of my grandfather's head. That was incidental. I had become the first Yankee boomerang. But that success fashioned another boomerang, an emotional boomerang that was nearly kill me. My obsession to be #1 would follow me thereafter. I couldn't hold a tune, so I became a fiddle player. But I couldn't be just another player, I had to be leader of the band. I was tall and gawky, so I became a ball player. But I couldn't be just another player, I had to be captain of the team. I was shy, so I became popular, the class president. In everything I did, I had to be #1. Because for vague and unknown reasons, I felt unworthy. Well, away at boarding school, my grandfather's liberal allowance, I pushed myself to be accepted, I drove myself to be outgoing. The only missing ingredient was romance. I was soon to find that, Mr.'s daughter. The prettiest girl in town, of course. My world was complete. But then one morning, that world came crashing down. At a school assembly, the headmaster told us of the sudden and tragic death of my sweetheart. I was devastated, putting me into another depression that would last for several years. I was never #1. I was never in control. I was lost, and I was only 17. Well, about this time I met Lois, dear, precious Lois. Her family had been coming to Vermont from New York for the summers for years. Eventually we met, with her love and concern, helped me recover from those dark days. And I subconsciously had found another mother to replace the woman I had lost at the age of 10. A job I'm sure she never bargained for. Well, with our entrance into World War I and my military college experience, I was commissioned 2nd Lieutenant, United States Army Artillery. Lois and I married, and she came to me in my first posting in Bedford, Mass. Now, my marriage and Army commission had opened up a whole new world for me, a world of wealth and class. My wife's father was a successful New York doctor, and his reputation alone opened the doors to some of the finest homes in New England. It was at one of those homes I met a butler for the first time. It was enough to bring me down to a point where I felt awkward, inferior, clumsy, unable to participate in any and all the small talk that took place at those events. But then I found alcohol. Before that, I held a fearful, almost awesome respect for all hard liquors, thinking it was the reason for my parents' divorce. Now, while my father was a binge drinker, I don't believe he was one of us, but there were plenty others in that family tree. It's at one of those parties that a young woman handed me a drink, a Bronx cocktail. Without a second thought, I drank it. It may have taken a while, but it seemed to happen instantly. My body began to relax, a stiffness came out of my shoulders, and I could feel a warm glow seeping through me to all the distant, forgotten corners of my being. I suddenly began to realize that people weren't being introduced to me, but I was being introduced to them. I wasn't joining groups, groups were forming around me. I had to laugh because it was a miracle. It was a miracle that has affected me mentally, physically, and as I would soon learn, spiritually. As I looked around, I realized these were not superior beings, they were friends. I liked them, and they liked me. As I was leaving the party, I could hear the whine of a saxophone, little voices rising and falling. But they in no way interfered with the newfound joy I was feeling. No, my world was all around me, young and fresh and loving. And as I made my way down the drive, I could feel myself moving easily, gracefully, as though I knew exactly how I felt. All my life I've been living in chains, but now I was free. Well, as the case of some of our meetings, this will not turn into a recounting of my drinking history. We just don't have the time for that. But let's just say for the next 16 years, I drank and drank and drank some more. I was discharged from the Army, never having fired a shot, or in my case a shell in anger. And upon return to New York City, Lois and I did what millions of other returning soldiers did. We began to settle down, look for a job, and start a family. So to help some relatives and friends, I was able to land a job as a clerk at a large railroad company. Now remember, I had to be number one. And when I soon found out that I would not be president of that company in less than a month, I lost interest. Lost interest to the point of becoming fired. So bouncing around for a while, I finally found Wall Street. Now I don't think I need to explain to anyone here tonight what Wall Street was like in those days. Everyone was making fortunes. Paper fortunes, but they were fortunes nonetheless. For the next 10 years, I was on the roller coaster ride of my life. But then, the crash in 1929. In just a few days, we were broke, we were in debt. I became known up and down the street as a no-account drunk by everyone. Everyone, that is, except me. Because you see, I believed I could make a comeback. So day after day, week after week, month after month, and year after year, I tried to operate on the street as a walking, crawling drunk, with little or no luck. A buck here, a buck or two there, but never the big deal. I was a pariah now in very hostile waters, in and out of sanitariums, living off my poor wife and her family. That is what brought me to my Meditowns. I was not a pretty sight, but a sight I'm sure familiar to many of you here tonight. Dr. Silkworth's diagnosis was devastating. Lois and I were thoroughly frightened. Frightened enough to keep me on booze, or dry, for the rest of my life. But it was an agonizing sobriety, agonizing. And as the case of many of us, my sobriety got the best of me. Yes, it was November 11th, 1934. I was dry for a couple of months, still unemployed, and being that the weather was nice, I decided I'd play a little golf. Lois, anxious at first, tried to convince me otherwise. She said, "Bill, stay home and get stronger." But I convinced her otherwise, and I was on my way to Staten Island for the day. So on the bus ride from the ferry to the country club, I met a man carrying a rifle case. Now I don't know about you, but when I see a man in New York carrying a gun, I want to find out what he's up to. So we fell into an enjoyable conversation. And again, I felt like the number one guy, and being from Vermont, I knew a thing or two about hunting rifles. All of a sudden, our bus was rear-ended by a taxi cab. And while we're waiting for a replacement bus, my friend noticed a speakeasy nearby and suggested we go in for a drink to kill the time. Well, he ordered a highball and I ordered a ginger ale. And when he asked me if I was on the wagon, for no particular reason, I told him my drinking story. Blow by blow, dollar by dollar. Our replacement bus soon came. We were on our way to the country club. I invited my newfound friend in for lunch, being that we still had some time to kill before I had to tee off. On my brother-in-law's tab, of course. I didn't pay for much in those days. Some things never change. Well, the dining room was closed in honor of the holiday, and the bartender set us up at the bar with a couple of sandwiches. And my newfound friend was amazed that here I was in the sea of alcohol and didn't even think of taking a drink. Now I began to think this was the smartest man I'd ever met. But as lunch was coming to a close, the bartender set 2 drinks in the bar, and to the sheer horror of my guest, I drank them on down. Now the man that had this smart look now had the dumbest expression I'd ever seen. All he could do was look at me and stare and say, "With your drinking history, how could you drink that? You must be insane." I said, "You're right. I am. I am crazy." Well, Lois was to find me later that night, passed out in the alleyway of our home, my head cut and bleeding from a fall, and still clutching my bags of unused golf clothes because, you see, I didn't play golf that day. I got drunk. I now knew I could no longer control my drinking. And if I was to drink, I'd have to do it in the safety of my own home. So that's exactly what I did. Day after day, I sat at my kitchen table, drinking gin, reviewing my life and cursing fate, and writing patrolling bombastic notes to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, telling him he was the wrong Roosevelt in the White House and what a terrible job he was doing. Notes unanswered so far. Lois never mailed them. And there I sat, waiting for Silky's diagnosis to come true. Death, madness, what have you. Or until I could get the Dutch courage to do it myself. That is how my friend Ebby was to find me. Now, Ebby was an old boarding school chum who later became a drinking pal. Long ago, I had him pegged as hopeless. Because you see, just a couple of months ago, up near where he lived in Albany, he drove his car into someone's living room, and upon exiting the wreck, asked the startled owner for a cup of coffee. Well, they got the cops instead. I meant to ask Ebby, how'd you get out of that scrape? For future reference, of course. Well, we had been out of touch for a while, and I hated to be alone, drunk or sober. So I made for a drunk the ultimate sacrifice. I fished out of hiding my last bottle of bathtub gin, and I set 2 drinks on the table, awaiting my old friend's arrival. It'd be a pleasant afternoon, or so I thought. And this is one of those moments that Carol spoke about earlier, that could only have one author. Well, I didn't have long to wait. Before I knew it, there was a knock at the door. And as soon as I opened the door, I could tell something about my friend was different. Something about him had changed. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but when we got settled at the kitchen table, I soon found out what that change was. "How about a drink, Eb?" I asked. "No thanks, Bill, I'm not drinking." "Not drinking? What are you, on the wagon?" He said, "No, Bill, I'm just not drinking today." "Just not drinking today? Eb, what's gotten into you?" He said, "Well, Bill, I don't need it anymore. I got religion." My heart sank. I figured I'd let a religious nut in my house. It seems my friend changed in his dipsomania for religomania. But I was raised to be a good host, and I figured my gin could outlast any of his rantings. So I said, "What type of religion have you found, my friend?" He said, "Well, Bill, I guess you could call it the religion of common sense." Well, I have never heard of Our Lady of the Common Sense. So I said, "Go on, tell me more." He said, "Well, Bill, you and I have been in touch for a while. I don't think you realize how bad my drinking has become." "Well, it's gotten pretty bad." "Well, just a couple of months ago, they tried to put me away for good. With the help of some friends, one a complete stranger, I fell in with a group who had ideas peculiar to them. And I was able to put those ideas to work on my drinking. And it did the trick for me." I said, "What kind of ideas was that, Eb?" He said, "Well, Bill, first I had to get completely honest with myself about my drinking and what it had done. Then I had to talk it over with another person, in complete confidence, of course. And then having done that, I had to make restitutions for all the harms I had done. and then I had to help others. That's why I'm here today, Bill. I'm here to help you. I was insulted. I didn't need any help. I was doing quite fine here in Brooklyn, drinking myself to death. And he says, Bill, this last part will probably shake you up. Yet ask God, whatever God you could find, to help you with the first 4 ideas. Well, he was right. I was shook up. I had no use for God. Now, I did have an inkling of a supreme being, but a personal God you could ask favors of? Never. My quasi-engineering background wouldn't allow it. Well, Ebby soon realized he was wearing out his welcome, but before he left, he said he could be found down at the Calvary Mission Church down on 23rd Street, and the name of his newly found organization was the Oxford Group. I said, well, you know, I could freeze over before I come down to some Calvary Mission Church. Well, Ebby soon left, and I returned to my drinking. But something peculiar happened. I couldn't drink the thought of Ebby off my mind. I kept thinking, why was I drunk and why was he sober? Ebby had become my new obsession. And I began to think, if a man came to me with a cure for a life-threatening illness, wouldn't I follow that man wherever it took me, even if it meant crawling on my hands and knees to get there? So I decided I would check out this Oxford Group. You know, the same way you check out a company before investing in its stock. Only Lois and I would not have to know about it. I could do it on the QT. So, with a few dollars begged from Lois, I was on my way to satisfy my curious, rational mind. Now, the first mistake I made was I got on the wrong subway. Ended up on the west side of Manhattan instead of the east side. And on 23rd Street, the biggest part of the island, I had to walk clear across town. I began to pass a few bars on the way. Then I began to look in the mirror, in the windows to see if I was missing anything. And before you know it, I found myself drunk in a saloon a couple of blocks from the Mission, totally oblivious as to why I was in the city that day. Coming to, I realized I was talking to a fisherman. And it dawned on me that I was in town to talk to fishers and men. Well, I grabbed my newfound friend. We were off to seek the grail. When we got there, Tex Francisco was at the door. He was a big fella, and he wouldn't let us in, because you see, we were just too darn drunk. But Ebby soon came along, and he got us in. So when the meeting started, there I sat in my Brooks Brothers suit, among life's rejects and society's discards. As I took a look around the room, I realized, well, hell, these fellows aren't so bad. I mean, they drink the same way I do. And when they asked for sinners to come forward, well, yours truly got up. Because you see, after being in alcoholic isolation for years, I couldn't pass up the opportunity to get back in the spotlight. So I hallelujah and witnessed to the best of them. I was jumping for Jesus. I was probably in a blackout. I don't remember exactly what happened, but I know I couldn't stand the idea of some drunk coming up to me and say, hey, Bill, you sounded good at the Mission last night. But again, something peculiar happened. On the way home, I didn't even think of taking a drink. A small fact, but noticeable nevertheless. And when I get home, I drank just enough to keep from the pain and withdrawal. And I began to think. And I thought, I still struggle with the idea of a personal God. But I wanted to survive, and survival won. So I decided that I would check into Towns Hospital, get sober, and pursue this spurious assumption of a personal God. Well, everyone knows you're going to get sober, might as well get good and drunk first. Well, with 6 cents in my pocket, I had to find the last store in Brooklyn that would lend me some credit for a few bottles of beer. Well, I found that store, but it was Lois's credit that got me those first 2 bottles. Those last 4 bottles, the first 2 I drank down right away. The third I tried to give away on the subway ride to Manhattan, but with no takers, I had to drink that one myself. And when I got to Towns Hospital, I waved the 4th bottle over my head and I announced to Dr. Silkworth, I finally found the formula to get me sober. Poor Silky. Took one look at me with that bottle in my hand. He said, okay, Bill, you know where your room is. go upstairs and get into bed. Well, 3 days later, he came to visit me. Now here's a man that practices what he preaches. He was here to help. I said, Ed, what was that neat platform you used for getting sober? He said, well, Bill, you've realized you're licked, admit it, and get ready to turn your life over to the care of God. Okay, Ed. Well, Ebby soon left. I fell into another deep, dark depression. I felt as if I was at the bottom of a pit, and I still gagged on the idea of a personal God. My quasi-engineering background wouldn't allow me to believe it. But with my last ounce of obstinate pride crushed, I found myself crying out, if there is a God, let him show himself now. I'm ready to do anything, anything. And at that moment, it seemed as if the room lit up with a great white light. And in my mind's eye, I felt as if I was on the top of the mountain, with wind, not of air, but of the Spirit, growing through me as the answer to it all. And I thought to myself, this is the God that the preachers talk about. And coming to, I realized I wasn't alone in that room anymore. A great sense of peace and joy had overcome me. But I had to ask someone, is it real? Am I sane? So I asked Dr. Silkworth. He said, well, my boy, I'm but a simple man of science. I know little of these spiritual conversions that you talk about, but I have heard about them and read about them, and it sounds like that is what has happened to you. And you better hold on to it because it's all you got. Well, the next day more light dawned. Ebby came to visit me and he brought with him a copy of the book, The Variety of Religious Experiences by William James. I devoured that book. James believed that a religious conversion can come in many forms, sort of like gifts from the blue, objective reality. Some flowed out of religious channels, others did not. Some were gradual, and others were much quicker, like what happened to me. But all had the common denominator of calamity, hopelessness, and deflation at depth. Deflation at depth. Yes, that would have happened to me. And that would have happened to the complete stranger that helped Ebby. He was a patient of famous psychiatrist Carl Jung. And Carl Jung told him that his alcoholism had made his life hopeless and that he needed a spiritual conversion. Well, he found his way to the Oxford group and was able to get sober, put those principles to work on his drinking, and pass it on to Ebby. And Ebby in turn passed it on to me. But it was a two-sided message, one of hopelessness and one of hope. You see, I'd been living in a cave of loneliness. And for years, my wife, my friends, my family, even my doctor tried to come in and get me out of that cave. But it wasn't until a fellow cave dweller could come in, Ebby, and take me by the hand and lead me out. Because you see, he knew the way. And at that moment, I had a great revelation, a vision of one alcoholic helping another. Sort of like the Washingtonian group 100 years earlier, which proves there's nothing new under the sun. And I thought I wanted to do this more than anything else I'd ever wanted to do before. Well, 3 days later I went home. And 3 days after that I joined the Oxford group. The Hound of Heaven had finally overtaken Bill Wilson. Now the Oxford group was a non-denominational, theologically conservative, evangelically styled attempt to recapture the Christianity they thought that was around immediately after the death of Christ. It was started by a Lutheran minister in Allentown, Pennsylvania in 1908, Frank Buckman. It didn't catch on in the States right away. It wasn't until he took his movement to Cambridge, England. It was there at Oxford University that our friend Roland, the complete stranger that helped Ebby, found his way to the Oxford group. You see, they got their name from lazy railroad porters who wrote on the baggage claim ticket, the Oxford group, rather than their formal name, the First Century Christian Fellowship. I was not a fan of organized religion. As a matter of fact, I had many a fight over organized religion and blood was spilled. My blood, but that's another story for another day. I was attracted by the tone and the style of the Oxford group. They preached non-verbally that it was a joy that they found in their fellowship, and they simply sought a Christian life through the passing of stages of conversion, conviction, confession, and continuance. All wrapped up in the steps of give to God, check that guidance, share with others, thereby witnessing, helping someone else while at the same time helping yourself. They called that soul surgery. All wrapped up in the four absolutes of absolute honesty, absolute purity, absolute unselfishness, and absolute love. A tough course for anyone, never mind a washed-up drunk like me. But I was able to put those principles to work on my drinking and did the trick for me. The Oxford Group had tried to help alcoholics for years, with little or no luck. And the drunks attracted me at first when I got there. There was a few of them when I first got there, poor souls in and out of sobriety. And the Oxford Group figured I would come around to their way of thinking sooner or later. After the meetings, we called them house parties or drawing room conversations, once a fancy dance sitting around talking to one another. We would go over to Stewart's Cafeteria on the east side of Manhattan and sip coffee late into the night. I'll never forget the joy and fellowship we found in those early days. After a while, we began to have a few of the members over to our house. And before you know, we had a regular flow of them in and out. Lois really liked that. We found that even in that informal atmosphere, we didn't take too kindly to directives like absolutes. But even in that relaxed atmosphere, no one was staying sober for any length of time. Nobody that was except me. And it wasn't for lack of trying, because I was down at that Calvary Mission Church every chance I could, talking to every drunk I could, telling him about my white light experience. If he wanted what I've had, then he better have happened to him what happened to me. Well, if they stood me long enough after my sermon, and no dough was coming, they simply twirled their fingers around their forehead, made a funny face, and off they went, and left me holding the bag. After about 6 months, I realized nobody was staying sober for any length of time. And it wasn't except me. I had to ask Dr. Soapworth, how is it that Ebby can pass it on to me and I buy it, but when I pass it on to someone else, it doesn't work? Well, his answer was immediate. He said, Bill, when you're talking to another drunk, talk drunk to another drunk. Hit them hard with the disease concept of alcoholism, that they have a body that's allergic to the very substance it craves, and only drive them to madness or death. Once they understand that, then you can talk to them about the hope you found in spirituality and recovery. Well, he was right. It did the trick. Nothing too spectacular, but enough to know I was on the right track. I mean, they weren't running away from me anymore. Well, about this time, people began to realize, well, Bill's got this liquor problem solved. Why does he get himself a job? Get Lois out of that damn department store. Well, that's exactly what I did. With the help of some friends I still had on Wall Street, I was sent on a mission. A mission to Akron, Ohio, in the spring of 1935. Akron, the little city on the hill, we like to call it, was the tire capital of the world. B.F. Goodrich, Goodyear, Firestone were all headquartered there. And nobody would talk to anyone. Never mind a group of raiders like us from New York, who were there for a hostile takeover. But we soon found out that there was a group of from Chicago, and being they were Midwesterners, they had the inside track. Well, that deal went south and went south fast. And they left me holding the bag and beat it back to New York. So there I was in the Mayflower Hotel, a hot Saturday afternoon, the day before Mother's Day, holding the bag, my dreams dashed of becoming a president of a small tire company. I had $10 in my pocket. $10 enough to be king for a day back in those days. And I began to hear the sounds of the bar at one end of the lobby. You know those sounds. The people talking, the glasses clinking. And I thought if I could go walk in there and strike up a conversation, order up a glass of ginger ale, or ginger ale on my foot, I began to panic. And I thank God for that panic. because I realized that the same panic that set in 100 times before I went out on another drunken bender. And I thought to myself, what has kept me sober these last 6 months? Why, talking to another drunk, of course. But where am I going to find another drunk the day before Mother's Day? In Akron, Ohio. Well, I noticed on the other end of the lobby a church directory. And looking at some names, I noticed the name of Reverend Walter Tunks. Now, I took that as a good omen. Because you see, growing up as a child in Vermont, we went for a walk in the woods, we called it a tunk. So I dropped a nickel in the payphone, and I blurted out to the good Reverend I was a rum hound from New York, and I need another drunk to talk to. Now, I think the Reverend could handle us one at a time, but I don't think he was too sure about getting a group of us together. But it turns out he was a big supporter of the Oxford group, and he gave me a list of 10 names, 10 fellow Oxford group members who may know of another drunk that I could talk to. Well, I got busy and dropped a few more nickels into the payphone, and the first 9 calls were either out to the call, hung up on me, or didn't know of another drunk I could talk to. But the last call I made, the 10th call, was to a man who was packing his bags that very minute and getting ready to leave town. And why he didn't know of a drunk I could talk to, he did know someone who might. So he gave the name of Henrietta Seiberling. Well, my heart sank. You see, I couldn't call Henrietta Seiberling. I figured that she was the wife of Frank Seiberling, the president of Goodyear Tire Company. How could I call him up and let him know I'm a drunk and I need another drunk to talk to in order to stay sober? Well, my fear overcame my shame and I made that call. And Henry, as we like to call her, when she figured out I was who I said I was, she had me come over right away. Because you see, Henry joined the Oxford group a few months ago, and it turns out she wasn't the wife of Frank Seiberling. She was a soon-to-be ex-daughter-in-law. And she wasn't living in the estate, she was living in the gatehouse. And she was about to be excommunicated from the will. So, she joined the Oxford group when her marriage began to falter, and she was looking for some spiritual guidance. In the group, she met a man who had a secret. A man who had a drinking problem. And, like Oxford group members were known to do, she took up a prayer campaign on his behalf and prayed for him to help him to stop drinking. Well, it hadn't worked so far. So here it was, she thought it was a good omen that here I was, this man from New York, who thought he'd found a cure for alcoholism, looking for another man to talk to. So she had me come over right away. And she made a call. A call to a friend in trouble. She called Ann Smith, the wife of Robert Holbrook Smith, M.D. Well, Ann came up with some lame excuse and said Bob couldn't come over. But truth finally went out, because you see, that afternoon, Bob brought home a plant, a potted plant for Mother's Day, and set the plant upon the kitchen table. And being that he was more pot on the plant, he passed out underneath the table, and Ann couldn't wake him up to save his life. But she promised to bring him over the next night. So next night I met Dr. Bob. He was a tall, imposing figure, 15 years my senior. Grew up 75 miles from Vermont, a fellow Vermonter. And on the way over, he told his wife Ann that he'd give me, this bum from New York, 15 minutes. And then come in and tell me that there's been some plane crash or a train wreck, and that I have to get out of there. No rumhound from New York was going to lecture him on the evils of alcohol. Well, when I took one look at Bob, I could tell he was in rough shape. And I said to him probably the only thing that would work. I said, you look like you could use a drink. Well, later on he admitted that here's a fellow who knows the score. And remembering Ebby's comments at my kitchen table and what Silky told me, I told him about my drinking and what it had done to me. How I had a disease that I was allergic to the very substance it craved and that would soon kill me or drive me mad. Because you see, if I had talked to Bob about God, that meeting would have ended in 15 minutes. Because Bob had spent his life in pursuit of God. He was the son of a preacher. He was a member of the Oxford group for 6 years to my 6 months. But when I told him about the disease of alcoholism and how it had devastated me, he took that idea to heart. And when we were done, that meeting lasted 4 hours. Either Bob or I could know exactly what we talked about When we were done, Bob asked if I could stay and help him get sober. Well, being I was virtually unemployed, I figured I would stay for a while. I'll never forget the joy and fellowship we found at that little house on Ardmore Avenue. Every morning we would get up and pray and meditate. Ann would go about her business of the house. Bob would continue his practice that really had been devastated because of his drinking. He was only able to practice medicine at the Akron City Hospital. He had a small office in a commercial building downtown. Because you see, his surgery skills were as renowned as his drinking skills. You know, Bob was a proctologist. There was a running joke in town that when we went to see Bob, you put your ass on the line. So things were going along fine. And one day Bob decided that he was on his way to the American Medical Convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Well, neither Ann or I thought this was a good idea, but Bob said, I haven't missed one in 34 years, I'm not going to start now. Well, Bob later admitted that he began to drink as soon as the train pulled out of the station. We found him 5 days later holed up with an ex-nurse and her husband in the suburbs of Akron. When we went to get him, my initial reaction was, this thing isn't going to work. I might as well just go back to New York and pack it in. The only thing that kept me was Bob had an important operation to perform and he was in no shape to do it. So we went to work right away getting him sober. I used my famous hangover cure, cold sliced tomatoes, sauerkraut, and Karo syrup poured directly down your throat. It does the trick, trust me. Well, the day came, we brought Bob to the hospital and he says, I'm ready. I thought to myself, well, I hope you're ready. We spent the 3 days getting you there. Well, the operation was a success. The patient lived, but there was no sign of Bob. Ann and I waited all afternoon. At 5 o'clock he walked in, and he was stone cold sober. Because you see, after that operation he went all around town, making restitutions for all the harms that he had done because of his drinking. That was June 10th, 1935. Bob would never drink again, and he began to work the 6 steps in the Oxford group. Well, a few days later, Bob says, Willie, we'll never get anywhere talking to ourselves. We need another drunk to try this out on. But where are we going to find another case? So Bob called up the Akron City Hospital, spoke to the nurse supervisor in charge, and said, we think we found a cure for alcoholism. Do you have any patients we could try it out? Well, the nurse supervisor knew Bob's secret and said, Bob, have you tried it out yourself? Bob, not to be taken aback, said, yes, I have. We think it worked. And she said, well, I think we have just the man for you. We just admitted a man who was here 5 times this year for various lengths of stay because of his drinking. He blackened the nurse's eye, so we have him tied down to his bed for his and the staff's protection. Would he do? Bob said yes. Put him in a private room, we'll be down by and by. Well, that afternoon we met Bill D., a well-known Akron attorney, former town councilman, in and out of the hospital 5 years that time, for various lengths of stay because of his drinking. And when we got there, we asked him if we could spend a few minutes with him. He said, well, fellas, I'm not going anywhere. So we proceeded to tell him our stories, blow by blow, dollar by dollar, and how we stay sober by talking to one another. He said, well, fellas, that sounds good to you. But for me, I don't think it'll work. As a matter of fact, I asked my wife to commit me to the Ohio State Hospital for the mentally insane. Because you see, I can't walk out of this hospital a free man and risk hurting myself or my family like I did that nurse. And as far as God, I haven't forgotten about God, but I think God has forgotten about me. So thanks, but no thanks. Well, as we were leaving, I thought maybe we missed something. And I turned and I asked him, do you mind if we come back tomorrow? He says, sure, fellas, you can come back tomorrow. I mean, no one likes to talk to us drunks when we're in this state. No one likes the sight of us, the smell of us, the sound of us. So yes, please do come back tomorrow. And come back we did. The next day, Bill was sitting up in his bed when we got there. His wife was sitting next to him. As soon as we got there, he jumped up and he says, "There they are. There they are, honey. They're those two fellows I was telling you about. One's a doctor in this very hospital, and this other one's here from New York on business. Go on, fellas, tell her. Tell her your stories." So we proceeded to tell her our stories once again, drink by drink, blow by blow. When we were done, Bill said, "If you can do it, I can do it." And Bill joined our group, in a group whose time had come, and we had no name. And we found out that it worked on someone who wasn't a member of the Oxford group. It worked on someone who was estranged from God. It worked on the lost and the lonely. Well, summer was coming to a close, and I realized the proxy deal was dead and I had to get back to New York. Lois actually missed me. But Bob and I continued to start what we did back there in Akron, talking to other drunks. We'll never know how many we talked to, surely several thousand. There were a few misses, a few total losses, a few tragedies. But miracle upon miracle, a few got sober. 2 years later, we got together once again in Akron and counted up 40 men among us who were sober 6 months or more. That's the watermark we used. And why Bob said, "That's good," we'll probably have 1,000 by the year 2000. We're operating at retail, we need to kick it into wholesale. We need to provide some organization. Well, I volunteered to be that organization. My first order of business was coming up with a name. I came up with the name the Bill Wilson Movement. Well, nobody liked that. One of our members kept saying, "Anonymous Alcoholics, Anonymous Alcoholics." So we settled on the name Alcoholics Anonymous. Well, I can't tell you what happened next, or for that matter, what happened over the next 15 years. But I will tell you it was a wonderful, amazing time that I'll never trade in for $1 million. I will tell you that we wrote a book, Alcoholics Anonymous. We expanded the steps from 6 to 12. It took us 2 years to write that book, another year to get it published, another year to sell copies in reasonable amounts. How's that for organization? We wrote the traditions. It took us 4 years to write the traditions. The traditions are to the group what the steps are to the individual. 5 more years to get them accepted at our convention in Cleveland last summer. AA is a benign anarchy, an organization not in the typical sense of the word. And I will tell you, this book and the steps it contain is merely a suggestion. But if you do work these 12 steps, you will have a spiritual awakening. What is a spiritual awakening, you ask? Well, it's when you begin to do, act in a way you never thought possible. When you found yourself in the possession of a degree of tolerance of love, understanding, and patience, but in some way made yourself ready to receive this gift. How do you make yourself ready to receive this gift? Well, allow me to show you the path that we took. You see, we realized we couldn't be rid of our alcoholic obsession until at first we admitted we were powerless over it. And realized we couldn't do that ourselves, we had to find a higher power who would do that for us. Then we had to turn our will and our lives over to that power. Then we had to seek out the obstacles that kept us from sobriety, physical, emotional, and spiritual. We took inventory. And we had to quit this deadly business of living alone and share that with another person, in complete confidence, of course. Then, seeing that we still had some character defects that needed to be removed, we had to ask God, under the condition of the day, if He could or would remove our shortcomings. And then, we had to look at the people that we had harmed, and make a list of all the persons that we had harmed, and became willing to make amends to them, unless, of course, it would harm them or others. Then, we had to find a daily basis, a spiritual basis for living, and continue to take inventory. And if we were in the wrong, admit it promptly. Now, if there was a God that helped us get us sober, then He was worth knowing through prayer and meditation. Then we had to turn outward to our other alcoholics who were still suffering, and experience the gift of helping with no reward or prestige, and begin to practice these principles in all areas of our lives. Guard it with your life, because it is your life. But do not rely on the experience of yesterday to get you through today. The art of life is to live each moment as perfectly as we can. I want to thank you for allowing me to share some of my moments with you tonight. You've been wonderful. Happy anniversary, good night, and God bless. Before I go, there is just a couple of things I want to straighten out before I leave. It seems that some of our fellowship believe that I'm the sole founder of AA. I'd like to put that to rest once and for all. If it wasn't for Bob, with his guidance, patience, and tolerance, none of us would be here tonight. I sure know I wouldn't. And while I was visiting last week for the last time, him and I were discussing some serious matters about the fellowship. And we've decided that the Alcoholic Foundation, who is made up mostly of non-alcoholics that none of you know, we thought of what if something were to happen to both of us? Who would carry on the message of Alcoholics Anonymous? So we've decided to come up with a general service office and organization made up of members from groups from all over the world. More on that when we talk about our next convention in New York in the springtime. And as I was leaving, even though Bob was gravely ill, I know I had all of his attention on these serious matters. And Bob walked me to the door, and he pulled out of his hall closet this hat. I couldn't believe my luck that here he was giving it to me. I tried to swipe it on many occasions, but Lois always made me give it back. He said, "Here, Bill, put this on. It's raining out. I don't want you to get sick of you. We have a lot of work to do." And as I turned to go, I looked at the man who I'd been friends with for 15 years. A man I never had a hard word with. And he looked at me and he said, "Bill, don't blouse this thing up. Keep it simple. Keep it simple." He'd been telling me that for 15 years. And as I turned to go, I realized it wasn't raining out that night. He simply found a way to pass it on to me. Well, good night, God bless, and happy anniversary.